A reading from the book of Mark, chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. As he was walking alone, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collection station, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners."
Every yes means no to something else. Do you believe this? As we continue our series on the witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer today, we begin with this simple truth that runs through the heart of Bonhoeffer's theology and links beautifully his thoughts on personal faith and social responsibility. Every yes means no to something else. Do you believe this? We know it to be true at a practical level. The very fact that you are where you are right now means that whether you realized it or not, you inherently said no to being somewhere else. Every yes comes with a trade-off. When you decided to pursue a particular career, you implicitly said no to all other career options at that time. Why, for some students, is making that final decision on which college to attend such a big deal? Because when you finally say yes to one, it means you are saying no to all the other colleges you could have attended. Whenever I officiate at a wedding, I will ask the couple that decisive question about forsaking all others and being faithful to each other as long as you both shall live. Why? Because when we say yes to one person in marriage, we are necessarily saying no to everyone else. There is no ambiguity or hedging our bets with a yes. Every yes means no to something else. Maybe you've noticed that this is not true with a no. We can usually say no and still have several options from which to choose. But when we say yes to one thing, all other options are off the table. We are making a commitment to that one thing. Think, for example, of all the yeses that make up your life right now, your partner or spouse, your family, kids, grandkids, close friends, career, mortgage, car loan. Think about your yeses to your faith, your church, your volunteer commitments, your political causes, social networks, your lifelong projects. You have chosen all these things at the expense of so many other things you could have chosen. And because you have chosen them, they now require something of you. Every yes means no to something else. And every yes requires something of us. And while Bonhoeffer probably never quite said it this way, it is this simple truth that runs through the heart of his theology. Our yes to following Christ means no to something else. This idea is not unique to Bonhoeffer. Jesus captured it best when he once said, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other." Jesus was making the case that each of us must decide who we will serve, because we are all going to serve something or somebody in this life. There will always be plenty of masters putting demands upon us, but we can only give our whole selves to one of them. We can only say yes to one, and by saying yes to one, we are saying no to all the rest. Which master will we say yes to? For Bonhoeffer, that question was especially urgent because he believed that saying yes to Christ implicitly meant saying no to the Führer. Following Christ and answering the call to discipleship was not simply a matter of faith, it was a form of political resistance. Following Christ meant that one could not follow Hitler. We can only give our whole selves to one. And saying yes to one meant saying no to the other. By the time Bonhoeffer wrote The Cost of Discipleship, most Germans had said yes to the false gospel of Nazism, along with its platform of unbridled nationalism and legalized anti-Semitism, absolute allegiance of the whole person to the state. As Hitler consolidated his power, he ruled over every facet of German life, including the church. He demanded complete allegiance to the ideals of the regime. By abolishing all political rights and democratic processes, every German citizen answered to him. Police could suddenly detain persons without a trial, search homes without a warrant, seize property without cause, censor publications, tap telephones, forbid meetings. Hitler outlawed all political parties except his own. He purged universities of Jews and dissenters. He replaced the judicial system with his own Nazi People's Court. And he undertook to purge Germany of all Jews in the name of blood and soil, all with the support of Jewish or church leaders who, under pressure, sold out to National Socialism and eventually joined the Nazified church movement that was called the German Christians. The German Christians quickly became the majority, and their brand of Christianity would have been wholly unrecognizable to Jesus. They tried to serve two masters. They spoke openly about God, but they avoided any talk about Jesus or his radical commands to love our neighbor, to forgive our enemy, to show mercy or compassion for the outcast. They referred to God simply as an absolute being, or the divine, or Hitler's famous the Almighty. These references to God were absent of Christ and left intentionally vague, so that the name God became just an empty word into which any state ideology could be poured to support Hitler's agenda and abuses. This, by the way, is what Christian nationalism has always done over the centuries. It distorts and hollows out the true nature of God until it finally turns God into a political totem that demands our unquestioning obedience and worship. It deludes us into thinking that we can serve two masters. Bonhoeffer, along with a small group of ministers who made up the resistance movement called the Confessing Church, could see that the German Christian movement had merely cloaked itself in National Socialism. It was a rival religion that appealed to an entirely different God, a God of racial superiority and authoritarianism and nationalism, a generic God who was just an abstraction, a distraction used to justify a political platform. And it was out of this historical context that Bonhoeffer wrote his Cost of Discipleship, in which he points us to the God of Jesus Christ and a theology not of worldly power but of the cross, and a message that says that if every yes means no to something else, then our yes to Christ means no to any earthly power or attachment that demands our obedience. And that yes requires something of us. It requires responsible action. Bonhoeffer points to the gospel story about Levi, the son of Alphaeus, who was sitting in his tax collector's office one day when Jesus calls out to him, "Follow me." And all at once, Levi gets up and follows Jesus. There's no hesitation, no reservation for Levi, no questions about where Jesus is going or what following Jesus will even require of him. Levi needs no answers or certainties in advance, and Jesus does not even require Levi to have faith or believe anything about him in order to follow him. In the story, Levi just pushes himself away from his desk, gets up, and follows. Willing obedience is how Bonhoeffer describes it. Jesus calls, and Levi demonstrates a willing obedience to the call. This is Levi's first encounter with Jesus, and he becomes on that day a disciple. Not because he knows or believes anything about Jesus, but simply because he trusts Jesus enough to obey his command to follow. That word obey is so out of fashion today, isn't it? We American Christians pride ourselves in individualism and personal freedom. For many, obedience can be a trigger word. It sounds oppressive, regressive. Throughout history, the demand for obedience has been used to subjugate slaves and women, the weak and the poor. In today's world, obedience is for dogs. It otherwise hints of authoritarianism, patriarchy, blind acceptance, a lack of critical thinking. But when Bonhoeffer speaks of obedience, he doesn't mean any of that. By obedience, he simply means saying yes to the call of Christ in every moment, and then following up that yes with responsible action. Bonhoeffer is writing at a time when so many Christians have sold out to the Nazi gospel, turned a blind eye to the evils of extremism and genocide. They believe that they can serve two masters because of that historic theological claim that God's salvation comes by grace alone, and that once we say yes to that grace, there's nothing we can ever do that can take that grace from us. And if that's true, they said, then nothing is really required of the Christian. No responsible action is ever necessary, not even in this catastrophic moment in human history. Into this glaring contradiction between faith and action, between belief and doing the will of God, Bonhoeffer offers this stunning critique of Christianity of his day, and one that is relevant even still. He says, the response of the disciple is an act of obedience, not a confession of faith in Jesus. When so many had turned faith into a matter of affirming a set of propositions or beliefs about Jesus, Bonhoeffer says it's about obedience to the commands of Christ. Every Sunday here at St. Andrew, when I welcome people to worship, I say, no matter what you believe or whether you even believe at all, you are welcome here. People will sometimes ask me, does that mean that you don't have any beliefs around here at all? And what I have to remind people over and again is that while we do hold a particular set of beliefs as a community of faith, assent to those beliefs is not required upon entry. If you do not or cannot believe, if you struggle to believe or have doubts about what you do believe, or if you are afraid that you don't believe enough, it's for these very reasons that you do belong here. Because Bonhoeffer was absolutely right. The response of the disciple is an act of obedience, not a confession of faith. We don't change the world by telling it what we believe. We change the world by doing what Christ calls us to do. This is how Bonhoeffer puts it in his Cost of Discipleship. He says, if you believe, take the first step. It leads to Jesus Christ. If you don't believe, take the first step all the same, for you are bidden to take it. No one wants to know about your faith or unbelief. Your orders are to perform the act of obedience on the spot. Then you will find yourself in the situation where faith becomes possible and where faith exists in the true sense of the word. This is so different from what so many of us have been told about Christianity, that belief must come before we are good for anything, that we must have our faith all figured out before we can actually live it out. When I was a freshman in college, a guy knocked on my dorm room door one Saturday. He showed me a little booklet with these 4 talking points about Jesus. It was called the 4 Spiritual Laws. He said, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, but you are sinful and separated from God. Jesus is God's provision for your sin, and you must receive Jesus as your Savior and Lord. Only then, he said, can you know God's wonderful plan for your life. And he said, all you have to do is agree to these 4 truths and then pray this prayer. And then he looked at me and he said, are you ready to do it with me right now? And I said, hey, brother, I know that party got a little crazy last night, but is there something I'm not remembering? I didn't say the sinner's prayer that morning. I know many who have done so over the years, and I know how powerful that experience can be for people, but Bonhoeffer didn't call that inwardness of faith, that spiritualization of Jesus belief. Belief is not the assent to a set of propositions about Christ. It's simply trusting Christ enough, like Levi, to take a step in his direction and to do what he asks you to do. Bonhoeffer put it this way: only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes. If that sounds confusing, just think of it as 2 sides of the same coin called belief. It means belief and obedience are inseparable. By trusting Christ, we become more obedient to his commands. By obeying Christ's commands, we come to trust him more deeply. These are not sequential steps. One must not necessarily come before the other. They simply work in tandem. They're inseparable. When Bonhoeffer spoke of obedience to the commands of Christ, he wasn't talking about the legalism of observing all the laws and rules of religion, following all the do's and don'ts and oughts and shoulds of the Bible. When Bonhoeffer spoke of obeying Christ's commands, he was trying to answer the question, what is God's will for my life and for this world? And he pointed specifically to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, as our primary guide for knowing that will of God. In that famous teaching, Jesus commands his disciples to some radical action. Peacemaking, showing mercy, resisting evil, loving and praying for the enemy, practicing forgiveness, giving to the poor, praying in secret, not judging others, doing good unto others, letting go of worry. These are some of the commands of Christ to which we are called to obey. And when we do these things, when we are obedient to these commands, we are saying yes to Christ. And we are saying no to all those powers that work against God's will for this world. Years ago, when I was still living in Southern California, I was walking with a friend along the oceanside pier. It was late fall. The air was crisp and cool. The sun was setting. We had met for dinner, and afterward, as we walked along the pier, we were talking when we were interrupted by a shirtless, shoeless stranger, a red face, wind-burned, and long tangled hair. "Excuse me," he said, "can you help me out?" I immediately started to pull a handful of spare change from my pocket when the stranger said, "No, I mean, someone stole my shirt and shoes today. It's going to be a cold night." And then he pointed to my friend and he said, "That's a nice jacket. It looks warm. Can I have it?" It was the most unexpected request, made even more astonishing given that the jacket was brand new and had just been gifted to my friend by his wife for his birthday. And my friend looked at me, puzzled, and then the two of us looked at each other, baffled, and there we all were, the three of us, speechless, just staring at each other in this suspended silence as the fiery sun slipped slowly into the Pacific. Until finally the silence was interrupted by the faint sound of my friend removing his jacket and handing it to the stranger. As that man walked away, I said to my friend, "You just gave away your brand new jacket to a complete stranger. You realize your wife is going to kill you. And where, by the way, did you get the crazy idea to do something like that?" My friend, he didn't hesitate. He just looked right at me and he said one word: Jesus. It reminds me of something C.S. Lewis once wrote, something I think Bonhoeffer seemed to be saying about the transforming power of obedience over the course of our lives. Lewis said this: "Every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into either a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. Which creature will we become?" Bonhoeffer would say it ultimately depends on what it is we say yes to, or better yet, who it is we say yes to. Who we say yes to determines the choices we make and the people we become. Our takeaways for today: every yes means no to something else. We can only give our whole selves to one master. Only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes.